Okay, here's what we'll do now. First, I'm going to ask our speakers to have a discussion among themselves, especially to have our speakers respond to the points that the discussant made. And then we'll open things up for questions. And at that point, I want to make sure everybody follows the 4 C's. The 4 C's are that your questions and comments should be compact, collegial, cordial, and constructive. I'll remind you of that if it's necessary to do so. All right. So let's start first with Albert and Ray. Do you have responses to the discussant?
There you go. Okay, I'm not sure what questions there were for me, but I think a question that I'm very interested in that's related to both the discussant and Albert's talk are what's domain specific and what's domain general in the zone of cognitive processes and cognitive representations. So I think we know there's a language module, and I guess there's more than one in bilinguals. And this is pretty separate from other cognitive modules. I'm thinking a little bit of Fodor's idea of modularity. But we have this general idea that there are domain general processes, and attention has certainly been touted as one. And maybe attention is needed to navigate whether we're in a linguistic interaction or an interaction, let's say, getting here, which we call spatio from our hotel rooms. Is that the same attention? That's a question. Question for everybody, I think.
I want to comment also on this. And in 1999, we published a paper after David Green published his paper in bilingualism. And we argue, I think we didn't read the paper at the time we published ours. So. And we argued that the system in speech production by which bilinguals control the language, okay, was intrinsic to the lexical system. It was not dependent on executive control. Well, we didn't even know that there was this issue about executive control. So we thought that the more the bilingual increases proficiency, the more automatic that control becomes, and it becomes incorporated in the lexical system or in the grammatical system. As, for instance, when you want to produce verbs, do you inhibit nouns? Or is just a selection process that pays attention in some way to the slots correspond to grammatical class. So the surprising thing is, at least in the realm of speech production, at that time, and I think that at this time, it's the same thing, there was little influence of inhibitory processes in the speech production, in the monolingual case. So our frame was always thinking about not including this inhibition, given the fact that that inhibition was not present in monolingual context. And they also have restriction rules. And there are models out there. There is a model by LaHaye arguing that you don't need inhibitory control. And for all we know, we need it. But that's an assumption. So I think that most of the evidence we have on language production can be accounted without resorting to that inhibitory processes. Now, for all we know, at the end of the day, yes, the system proposed by David works, and you really need to rely on inhibitory control and inhibitory control of a sort that is domain general. But, and Judy has some data suggesting that you are, when you switch languages, you do have some sort of cost, but whether that cost indexes inhibition or not, it's a very different issue. Now, and you were proposing a third possibility, and I thought that you were very happy with it, and I thought that was kind of argumentation, but not rhetorics, if you wish. So here there are two proposals: one in which the system uses domain general, and then or does not, or which sort of domain general processing, and then you say, well, there is a third possibility, which is there are different domain-specific executive systems. Something like that we're suggesting?
No, not really. I was trying to interpret your diagrams, and when you have the overlap, partial overlap, and you're saying that on the one side we have executive functions, or executive control, inhibition, whatever, and on the other side you have language.
Right.
Right? And so, but you're talking about executive language, linguistic executive functions, or you're talking about tasks that are measuring executive functions through language. This is how I understood it. And so if this is your conceptualization, then whatever is overlapping, this is executive functions. So what is the rest? So is it the language system? Because if we're talking about the language system, then we can talk about domain specificity. But if we're talking about executive functions related to language, then I'm not sure that we can talk about specificity, or we should be talking about specificity.
The idea is there are certain processes that do not hinge on executive control systems, right? And those are linguistic ingrained processes. So say, putting syllables together.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that does not involve executive control processes, at least when these processes become more automatic, right? And there might be other processes related to bilingual language control that are related to executive control, for instance, keeping track of what to say to which language to use to which person, right? Or keeping track that I cannot switch languages randomly. Mm-hmm. That might be depending on executive control processes, but other, for instance, lexical competition, we argued for a while. We were not successful. People pay attention, but then at some point they stopped paying attention to what we said. But we said that it was, that the evidence we had in terms of lexical competition across languages could be interpreted in different ways. And I still believe that, it's not that I don't care if I'm wrong or right, but I still believe that we don't have the good data to claim that inhibition at the lexical level, it's domain general. It could not even be inhibition.
Okay, we'll open it up for general questions now, and you know where the microphones are. I'm going to start things off by asking two questions. One has, both of them related to your discussion. So the first one has to do with how much attention we should pay to null results. And my understanding of meta-analyses is meta-analyses tell us exactly how much attention we should pay to null results. So the sort of meta-analysis that Ray has done would seem to suggest that indeed there is no effect. So I'm wondering what your view is on that, just at a technical level.
Yeah. So obviously it's very important to see if there are null results. What I'm saying is that it's not that we should discard null results, but when we have a null result, this is providing something inconclusive. So we have to find out, are there any factors that have contributed to that null result? And so, and that's why I'm asking, who are those bilinguals? Have we control for all the factors that we think may have interacted, or are there several factors that we haven't?
Okay. Since there are so many people lined up, I'm going to forget my second question. Don't forget to say who you are, because even though you may have said it yesterday, there are people here today who weren't here yesterday. So,
hi, my name is Reem Khamis Dakwar. I do work on Arabic diglossia using ERP. And I agree with Dr. Klein with the effect of implicit biases of researchers in even the questions that they both, I think Arabic diglossia is an extreme situation where you see there's a lot of bias towards showing that Arabic language is so different than any other natural language, which would go with odds, with that Arabs are odd people and we can do whatever we're doing to them now, which, it's another society question. But to be the devil's advocate, would you also think that using meta-analysis that is based on almost less than 100 studies might be also biased in that sense that, we're looking for a yes or no answer for a phenomena that has a lot of complexity in terms of the context, what the location, the language of majority, language of minority, SES. I can go on and on with the factors that can be attributed and co-founding for the no answer compared to the yes answer. As I'm trained as a speech pathologist, and we see the same trend into looking for meta-analysis just to find yes and no, when actually we're losing the nature of what we're looking for, which is looking for what is the process that is involved in being bilingual. There's a lot of research showing the connection between cognition and language. There's all of these fascinating studies on languages that do not have numbers.
Excuse me,
and how
I'm
it
going to
affects.
remind you of the first C.
All right, so
which
that's
is
my first
compact.
question.
Okay.
My second question is, no, I lost it. So my first question is how appropriate it is to use these meta-analysis studies when we have less than 100 studies to review within the diversity that we have. My second question is, how much are we conducting interdisciplinary studies in that sense that it seems to me that all of these studies are more in silo and each one is, focused on what they know within the context that they know in each different domain, and how can we be more interdisciplinary in the way that we're generating the study itself and conducting the study? Thank you.
So who's that question for? I'm going to take the second one, and I'll let Albert talk about the first one. I think we might give the same answer, but clearly the goal of the organizers of this conference was to stimulate interdisciplinarity. That's the name of the conference, and I think in terms of the, we'll call it invitation list. And interdisciplinarity is valuable. The field has a form of interdisciplinarity in the diversity of the silos that you mentioned. So it's not interdisciplinary, we'll call it within the studies, but between them. So there is quite a bit of interdisciplinarity already, and I think as a result of this meeting, there probably will be considerably more.
Right, and the first question, I'm not an expert in meta-analysis, but I think I did meta-analysis, not of this sort, a bit more, if you wish, a bit more elaborated, not just presenting the averages. And I think with less than 100, it's perfectly fine to do it. There's no problem. As long as you have some, as long as you list the variable. Where are you? Sorry. As long as you try to put all the variables that are maybe affecting the results. So yes, you could do the meta-analysis.
Okay.
I'm Ellen Bialystok. I want to thank Ray for solving a problem that many of us in the room thought was difficult. Apparently it wasn't. That's sarcasm. Your EF would have told you that.
So that's not...
3 very brief comments. It was sarcasm, Virginia. We're allowed to use it. First comment, you said, and I quote, your analysis includes a huge amount of the literature. I suggest your analysis is based on a tiny sliver of the literature dealing with reaction time studies of young adults who may or may not be monolingual and bilingual. Second comment concerns inhibition. After the work we did together, and around the same time in discussions with Albert, who was very instrumental in helping me see this, I realized that inhibition was not the answer. I've not used that as the explanation since 2004. And so you may want to revise your characterization of my prevailing thoughts. It's not inhibition. The third brief comment was actually articulated by the previous questioner. You've taken a very complex question about how the mind processes language and cognition and reduced it to a yes-no question. I don't think that's scientifically useful. Thank you.
And the speakers also need to respect the 4 Cs?
I wasn't listening when you told us about them because you were addressing the audience, but I will be brief, which begins with a B, I think. So I did begin my talk with history, so I think it was quite reasonable to emphasize inhibition as a key concept, which comes from Green and Bialystok's early ideas. And yes, I think there is a bit of a moving target problem with ideas that change because of the change in the landscape of what the literature is showing. Even in the 2004 paper at the end, we did talk about what we might call the global advantage. But as I would say I've shown, but I think it's the literature has shown, yes, using the narrow range of tasks, Simon Flanker and Spatial Stroop, that global advantage has disappeared, probably wasn't present in the first place. And I do think, as Albert has illustrated, that it's a very complicated relation between executive function and generally, and executive function specifically in dealing with two languages. And I wasn't trying to oversimplify that. I was answering a simple question. I think it has a simple answer based on the tasks that we reviewed. And I do agree with Alan that that's a selected set of studies, but it is all of the studies that we could find that use those particular methods, and we specifically chose them because there were a lot of studies, which comes back to the issue of should you do meta-analysis with just a few studies.
Hi, Deborah Titone from McGill. This was a very interesting session ranging from depression to euphoria, for me at least. And so one of the things that's been mentioned at this conference has been this idea of a bad microscope. So it feels like the conference here has focused on the bad or the problematic microscope from the side of executive function, but I feel like there's no microscope on the side of language and how language experience can differ. So I really resonated with the third speaker here, and in fact, in my lab, we have shown the third option that you present, the relation between individual differences in executive control and bilingual language processing in terms of what bilinguals do in the moment as they're engaging in language. And similar to the third speaker, we use statistics that are up to the challenge of studying this relationship, right? So we can control out the effects of L2 ability on the language task, and then over and above that, look for the additive effects of executive control. So my question is, for the first two speakers, what steps have you taken to try to figure out why it is you don't find a correlation? So in the correlations that you presented, did you partial out the effects of L2 ability? I assume that your bilingual sample is more homogeneous than the kinds that we get in Montreal, where we get every kind of bilingual. So that would be my question to you. And to Ray Klein, I wondered what steps have you taken to try to figure out how the different language samples might have pushed your meta-analysis results around?
Right. The first answer, the answer to the first question is no, we haven't done anything. Sometimes we look at how frequent people claim to switch languages, but that's a very, very rough measure. Or sometimes we, partial out the effect of people that claim that they don't use the other language ever. People, sometimes people say that in Catalonia and in Barcelona, and that's certainly not true. You could, they use it, they're exposed and they use it. So our population is very homogeneous, and no, we use brute force. We use brute force. We ran 200 people. What can I tell you? We had 300 people in our first paper. We had 200 people. In our second paper, we had 200 people. Now, of an homogeneous population, and sometimes it's the other papers that are more, that they do the covariate things. And that's perfectly fine. That's useful, but we don't do it.
So as probably many of you in the audience know, conducting studies in this area isn't one of my frequent activities. Reviewing them has been. And I do think that looking at the type of bilingual experience, how early children are exposed to multiple languages, the frequency of use of the two languages, the degree of switching between them in the, we'll call it everyday situation. All of these factors could be of interest. And as a sort of general comment, if it were the case that there were no extra-linguistic cognitive benefits of bilingualism, that doesn't mean that it isn't interesting to study bilingualism and its relationship to executive function. It's just two separate things. And I think the last slide that I showed suggested that there is a lot of work to be done here. And studies are emerging now that are looking at, within the bilingual group, whether any of these factors might matter materially for domain general executive control. And so far, the results are similarly negative, in my opinion.
Not in my hands there, but there you go. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Denise Errol, and I'm a graduate student at the CUNY Graduate Center. I wanted to thank all of you three for your very interesting and informative presentations. My question is for Dr. Costa. In your 2004 paper on asymmetrical switching costs in balanced versus less proficient bilinguals, you find that switch costs between L1 and L2 are not present in highly proficient bilinguals, but that there's a strong cost among less proficient bilinguals. I think Korean learners of Spanish and Spanish learners of Catalan, for switching from L2 to L1 and even from L3 to L1. I was wondering if you could explain how degree of proficiency impacts the magnitude of switch costs, and also to which degree the language of the environment, the university, may have affected these results. So
She knows more than you do about that paper, I think.
If you don't mind, I need to see the graph during the coffee break. I'll see the graph and I'll come. Now, I don't remember which, those were the Koreans, the Korean Spanish population?
So
Well, there were Koreans actually in that experiment.
that was one of my questions. Yeah, basically among the highly proficient bilinguals, there were no switch costs for the Spanish and Catalan who had been switching off all their lives.
There was switch costs. There was.
No asymmetrical switch costs. Sorry.
Asymmetrical switch. Okay, all right. So let's see if very short, very quickly. So what we found is that people that were proficient in two languages don't show asymmetrical switch costs, not even when they do that task in a first language, in a third language, in which they are not so high proficient bilinguals, right? So we test also the Korean Spanish bilinguals, Korean native speakers that were exposed to Spanish that were living there.
And they were learning also English, and the switch cost was slower. I mean, there was a smaller switch cost from.
Oh, I can't remember. Yeah. Let's talk about this in the coffee break. Sorry. Let's talk about this in the coffee break.
All right. Thank you so much.
Sorry.
Thank you all.
Hi, I'm Jongna Kim, a doctoral student in the Dr. Lauren Obler's lab at the CUNY Graduate Center. So I really appreciate all the interesting talks. So I have another question probably to Dr. Costa, but it's more general question, so you don't be afraid of that. So I have had an idea that I wanted to test in relation to pathological code switching. And some studies show that cognitive skills such as working memory or attention is trainable, and there are some studies that also show generalization effect to language production in individuals with anomia or aphasia. That I think supports the idea of domain general cognitive system, although most of those studies were case studies. So my idea is that if we train those patients with pathological code switching with non-linguistic cognitive control tasks, whether they're uncontrolled language switching or pathological code switching would improve. But based on your and your colleagues' findings in the previous studies about control mechanisms, it seems that there is only little or small amount of overlapping mechanisms between linguistic and non-linguistic system. So I'm wondering whether you expect no or little generalization effect if we, from the training non-linguistic control to linguistic control in patients with
Right, we are doing
pathological
that. We are doing the same study.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So we are doing the same study, and that's another way to get at the issue. We are doing that with healthy individuals and also with people that have some sort of compromise, neurological compromise, and see whether we can get them, whether there is some transfer. Now, the literature on transfer from cognitive ability to another cognitive ability is just kind of, it's not always that clear that you can do these transfers. But, that's one of the things that we are doing as another avenue to see whether there is some sort of overlap. But if you want to do that, I would suggest that you contact people that have done experiments on transfer from different cognitive domains.
Can I ask what kind of task you use?
I think that's better for you to ask during the break.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you.
Ken Papp. In our recent Cortex article, we report that 80% of the published tests for the yes-no question are null and 20% are positive. And I want to address the comment of the discussant that we need to pay more attention to the 20% that yielded positive findings. And my response to that is that we ought to look to see whether or not they replicate, particularly attempts to do very close replications. A very good example is the Pryor and McWhinney article that first reported switching cost advantages. Out of the 20 replications of that experiment, there's only been one that has produced a positive result. In general, the seminal studies in this area do not replicate. In our Cortex article, we...
Hold on. Do you have a question?
Yes, I'm going to...
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so do you want me to respond to that comment?
I just have less than a minute, if I may.
Yeah.
I think it's a good point. What do we make of the 20% of the positive results? Some can be type 2 errors, which are much larger than 0.05 if there are reporting biases as shown by simulations. Some of them could be failures to match on key variables like immigration and SES. And finally, alluding to yesterday's talks, some of these performance advantages may be on tasks that simply are not good measures of executive functioning because of task impurity problems. And so that would be my approach to your question to us.
I think it's quite important, actually, to discuss that issue a little bit further. So when we replicate, how do we replicate? Do we replicate with similar population? Because I'm not sure that this is always the case. So it may be a replication. We're picking up the same experiments. We're picking up bilinguals, but we may not be replicating the same type of bilinguals with the same history of bilingualism and the same life experiences. So my question is, for those 8%, I'm not saying that the 8% is wrong and the 8% is right. What I'm saying is we need to see this 80%, what are the characteristics? Was it really a replication or was it not replication? And similarly, for the 20%, basically also to understand a little better all those factors that interact with bilingualism, because we have a lot of factors, I think, and there hasn't been any systematic investigation to look at each one of them, put them into a model, and then see, how does it work?
There are other ways to go, right? Forget about 80 and 20. And that's something that I tend to do not very successfully when I talk to my students, which is I tell them, so they show the results in this realm or in any other type of research, and then they say, oh, this means blah, 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 blah. Then I get their finger here, and I get a knife. I say, look, are you ready to lose a finger if you are wrong? And then they say, well, better to do a conceptual replication. So we do conceptual replications. Journals don't care, so they tell you experiment 2 is the same as experiment 1. Well, no, really, it's not the same. It's a conceptual replication. And, sometimes you replicate conceptually what you get with the same population. It's the same guys, and that would help right? And I had this experience with our second paper on this issue in 2009. We got the same population, we ran the same study, just manipulate certain aspects. Surprise, surprise, the effect was with the same parameters that we had the first time, but no, the effect was modulated in other parameters, right? Now, you can criticize that those results do not replicate. I did my best. Around 400 people. I manipulate that slowly, perhaps, I manipulate that step by step. I replicate my previous results. They didn't replicate in the other percentages of conditions, and then I try to argue why that was the case. What can I do? If it happens that he doesn't replicate that, so, well, I did my best. If he doesn't replicate that, I think he has a problem more than I do.
Too.
Well, if that's true, I mean, you should, when you write your paper, you should acknowledge that as well. You say, look, you should, how do you account for those data, which is at the end of the day what he is saying.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Marta Kortkowska. I'm a doctoral student here at the Graduate Center. My question is a general one. Could the differences between findings in young adults, older adults, and children on this topic be partially attributed to the ceiling effect or a task not being challenging enough for this population?
I think that most of the experiments we did, there was, not with children, there was room for, there was room for variation. So I don't think we reach a ceiling effect, but might be true, the task might be too easy, some of them. Now, the effects are, some of the effects are sizable, there's like 100 milliseconds. There you do have some room. But it's also true that young adults, they play basketball, they play PlayStation, they do a bunch of things. So it's hard to spot how much variance or the impact that volleyball may give, right? That's what we are moving more to elderly people or to brain damaged individuals. And I think that the study of single cases could be very informative and see how information how performances dissociate more than associate. In our case, our patient had troubles in both executive control, domain general, and bilingual language control. But in other cases, there seem to be some sort of dissociations that in neuropsychology are fantastic to have.
Thank you.
If I can add one more point on that, especially when we're looking at children, we have the language which is developing, or the languages that are developing for the bilinguals. We also have executive functions that are developing. So it depends. It's also possible that it depends at what time we're testing a particular child. What was the development of language? What was the development of the specific function we're looking? What is the reliability of the task we're using? And so there may be misalignments or alignments between all those factors.
Hi, my name is Deepti Wadera. I'm a doctoral student here at the CUNY Graduate Center. Thank you for your talks, and I'm sorry the questions are taking so long, but mine is quick. It's actually for Dr. Marinas. So I wanted to talk about if we operate under the assumption that Dr. Costa brought up about how balanced, highly proficient bilinguals may have a more automatic language processing. How can we interpret the results that you saw of a difference between balanced and unbalanced bilinguals in the NBAC task? Because a lot of times I think the strategy that we see in the 2-back and the 1-back is a very conscious emptying and updating of the working memory. So how can we interpret the results if we think about balanced bilinguals as an automated language processing?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'm not sure I can answer it.
No, I understand.
We haven't really thought very much about it. This is some new findings. But the way we started thinking about it in terms of the NBAC is, as I mentioned, that there is, in terms of writing and literacy, the processes that we use when we read may be similar to some extent, or when we may be using some similar mechanisms. that the ones we use when you want to do the NBAC task. And so if you are literate in both languages, and if you have a fully automated system, then you may make less errors and you may be more successful on the NBAC. So the NBAC, this is an accuracy score. It's not a reaction time score.
Right.
So in terms of accuracy, you may be more efficient if you have exercise. So if you are literate and you're using reading and writing in both languages rather than if you're unbalanced.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Sure.
My name is Eleanor Saik Haddad from Bar-Ilan University, and I have two questions. They are all three welcome to answer, but probably this is more directed to Dr. Marinis. You referred to the bilingual education program, and I was wondering whether in your analysis of the different groups that you addressed in your study, you found differences in the bilingual advantage in executive functions between two groups of bilinguals, those who are acquiring the second language in the formal classroom context versus natural acquisition, because I was really interested in this advantage in the foreign language context. So this is the first question. And the second question, I study the effect of diglossia on Arabic language and reading development. And I was wondering whether in the diglossic context, which is though not a typical bilingual context, is different from, of course, a monolingual context. So it is a unique context that shares some properties with the monolingual and the bilingual context. In this context, the kids are not bilingual in the sense that they don't use the two languages equally in production. They speak the spoken language, but they read and write in the standard language. So my question is, do you think that this discrepancy in the amount of use of the standard language for oral language purposes would have an impact on the bilingual advantage in control and inhibition, executive function in general?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, actually. I'm going to start with the second one. So you're talking about Arabic, modern Arabic versus a local dialect. And there are many communities in many countries who have this issue of diglossia. And so it's very important, I think, to have a look at to what extent is it similar to bilingualism. That may also depend on the overlap between the standards and the local dialects. So I had a PhD student who worked exactly on that issue, not looking at executive functions, but looking at children who have in Kuwait, who speak monostand Arabic and also the Kuwaiti dialects, and then looking at how is the phonological awareness and whether they are better in learning English. And the results was that the ones who, sorry, I have to backtrack.
Yes, whether the ones
Actually, we were looking at whether the ones who are bilingual and have bilingual education, English and modern standard Arabic, are going to have better phonological awareness in Arabic than the ones who are going to a monolingual educational system. And we found differences in the ones who were bilingual, had better skills in terms of phonological awareness. And that was not just for modern standard Arabic, that was also for the Kuwaiti dialects. So it looks as if there is a relationship between those two. Now,
foreign language, yes, the foreign language context.
Yes. Yeah. So the first question was the foreign language context. And what was the question?
Well, whether you expect to see the bilingual advantage in executive function in this group.
I think it's possible. We need the evidence. No, we need the evidence.
So you didn't compare these two groups systematically in your bilingual program?
For the study that we did, for the data we presented, so we did find the bilingual advantage in that particular task, and this is how we are trying to understand why this is the case by looking at different factors.
Thank you.
Okay, I have Thomas Bach from Edinburgh. I have one comment and one question. So the comment is, generally, I would like very much to thank the speakers for setting up the stage for my talk in the afternoon, particularly to Raymond, because I think you have really give fantastic examples of logical errors one can do in analysis of the field, and I will dismantle them one by one in my talk in the afternoon. So I invite you. I don't want to lose too much time on that. The brown paper would not pass undergrad screening because there's no control group, and the 80%, well, unfortunately, some people are so busy writing papers nowadays that they have no time to read and are not aware of the development in the field. I mean, the Cortex paper of my colleague from San Francisco doesn't include any studies which simply don't fit his idea that were performed the last 2 years. I will come to it. My question is to Albert. Now, one of the things which I find very interesting, and thanks very much for giving us a chance to see the video of the patient and not just the comments, is that there was a very, very strong asymmetry. So basically Spanish seemed to me to be the default. So it was not really the question of control of mixing. And, you know, I have seen mixing in patients, well, including, unfortunately, my own mother when she had brain metastases, and it was really kind of mixing within the language and so on. Apparently, Spanish was the default, and in fact, she had a very few intrusions of Catalan in Spanish. I mean, I think one was galetas, which would be galletas in Spanish, so very, very similar one. But I mean, generally what happened was she was starting in fluent Catalan and then switch always back to Spanish. Yeah. So what's your view about this, so to say, is there always a kind of default language? I mean, it seems to me different than just mixing the two languages.
Right. There were the two things, but certainly there was, and that's why she was reported to us by her daughter, is that she seemed to start speaking in Catalan, then switches to Spanish, and not switch back to Catalan. So it was not a mixing thing. Certainly we don't know how to explain that because her first language was Catalan, and you know, and there are ways to check for that. I mean, she was teaching in the university in Catalan, and she was talking to her son in Catalan, daughters in Catalan. So we don't know why she resorts in we don't know. I mean, the phenomenon is true in our case.
And do you know of other cases? Because exactly as you said, I mean, she would be teaching and so on. So if anything, you would expect her to have Catalan as the standard language. So I was wondering whether, I mean, are there any other cases of like this that you know?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm sure if you go back to part of this book, there'll be.
I mean, in stroke aphasia, it's known that it's not always, so to say, the native language, and they are, well, descriptions going back to late 19th century of people who were kind of switching to the last language or the first language that was spoken to them when they recovered and so on. But it's a bit different from what you...
Right, but those results, Thomas, I mean, many, not all, many of those reports, you go back to the paper and there's no single number.
Yeah.
There's just observation of the neurologist in the acute state of the physical person that in the next morning when they go to test the patient, he recovered.
Yeah.
Right. So do you know Fernando Alonso, the guy that drives in the Formula One? So he had an accident the other day, and there was, and the knee was the main thing on the news was that he, after the concussion, he started speaking Italian rather than Spanish or English. Right. Apparently, it was not true. So he said, I never did that. Right. So where my point is that many of and that's a problem. Many of those cases that we have of partial recovery or, you know, pathological switching come from patients that are in acute state and we don't have any number.
Okay, so let me wrap up this session by saying I think we've seen that there is a lot of disagreement, a lot of inconsistency about how to interpret the results that have been discussed, and people pointing up the need for having a better idea of what executive functions are being measured by which tasks and what kinds of individuals, both monolinguals and bilinguals, that we're looking at. I'm going to end with one comment about whether we can talk about language-specific executive functions. So my understanding of executive function is that it's like G. And in the same way that it doesn't really make sense to talk about specific G, it doesn't make sense to talk about specific executive functions, that they're by their nature general, which doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of specific properties that are specific to language or any other domain, but that I think it's clearer if we think of executive function as something that is general and not some additional kind. Okay, I'm so happy to have the last word. We'll break now for lunch, and just recall that the afternoon talks are starting at 1 o'clock. So see you back here then.
Yeah, of course.
I'm going to use the toilet. And I said, that was so weird. And this thing, like this door, yeah, it works like this. You slide it, it kind of works like that. And it's actually glass, and it's supposed to look kind of like cloudy. It's still glass. You can still see it's like we just confirmed just like staying outside. Scrolling on my phone.
Au fond,